He sat across from her at a restaurant he never would have chosen himself. She was smart, attractive, the kind of woman who made conversations feel easy. Halfway through the second glass of wine, she leaned forward and said, "I think you're afraid of being vulnerable." He didn't argue. He didn't explain. He just smiled, the kind of smile that takes about 3 years of living alone to earn. Because the truth was, he wasn't afraid of being vulnerable. He'd been more vulnerable in the last 3 years than in the entire 22 years of his marriage. He just knew, with a certainty that sat in his chest like a stone, that there were 7 things he would never hand over again. Not for her. Not for anyone. And the strange part? It wasn't stubbornness. It wasn't bitterness. It was the clearest kind of love he'd ever practiced. Love for the life he'd finally built with his own hands. That kind of knowing doesn't come from advice. It doesn't come from a podcast or a therapist's office, though both of those help. It comes from loss, silence, and a list most men over 50 carry but have never written down. And what's on that list will probably surprise you, because it has nothing to do with what most people assume older men want. At this channel, we talk about the psychology behind how men actually grow past 50. Not the motivational poster version. The real shifts that happen when a man has lived long enough to stop pretending. This one runs deep. Let's get into it. Here's the thing about that list. Most men don't realize they have it until the night they sit alone in a quiet apartment and try to remember what they used to enjoy before they gave everything away. That's what happened to a man named Frank. 54. Mechanical engineer. Divorced after 22 years. Sitting in his first solo apartment. A 2-bedroom he picked because it had a window facing east. The morning light was important to him. He didn't know that about himself until he had to choose an apartment alone. 22 years of living with someone. And he'd never once picked a place based on what he wanted. The kitchen was always her domain. The schedule was always built around the kids. Even breakfast. He couldn't tell you what he actually liked to eat in the morning, because for 2 decades he ate whatever was efficient, whatever kept the household moving. That first Saturday alone, he sat at the kitchen counter with a cup of coffee and realized something that hit harder than the divorce papers. He didn't know who he was outside of being useful to someone else. Not in a dramatic, existential way. In a very specific, practical way. He didn't know what he wanted for breakfast. That's where the list starts. Not with grand declarations. With breakfast. But here's why that matters more than it sounds. Because if a man can lose something as basic as knowing what he wants to eat, what else did he hand over without noticing? The answer, it turns out, is almost everything. Meet Raymond, 57. Used to coach high school basketball. Built like a man who still remembers what it felt like to run a fast break. Every Sunday morning for the first 4 years of his marriage, he'd wake up at 5, drive to the lake, and fish until 9. It was the only time all week his mind went completely quiet. Then one Sunday, his wife said something that sounded reasonable. "If you loved me, you'd spend Sunday mornings with us." She didn't say it mean. She said it like it was obvious. Like it was a small thing. And because Raymond was 29 and believed that love meant proving it constantly, he stopped going to the lake. Now here's what nobody warned him about. He didn't just lose a hobby. He lost the only pressure valve he had. 27 years later, sitting on a dock he hadn't visited since his 20s, he could trace the entire arc of his marriage. Backward from that single concession. Every year after he stopped fishing, he became a little more depleted, a little more reactive. His temper shortened. His patience with his kids thinned. He started picking fights over dishes. Because the real fight, the one about needing space to breathe, was one he'd already surrendered before it even started. He ran on fumes for decades pretending he had a full tank. And when the engine finally died, everyone acted surprised. He wasn't surprised. He was just tired. That's the mechanism. Society taught men like Raymond that sacrifice equals love. And sometimes it does. But nobody drew the line between sacrificing for someone and erasing yourself. Most men over 50 did the second one for decades while genuinely believing they were doing the first. They dropped the Sunday fishing. So the morning run disappeared. So the college friends stopped calling because he never called back. Therefore, the financial decisions got handed over because it was easier than the argument. And each concession felt like maturity, like partnership, like love. But each one removed a load-bearing wall from the structure that made them who they were. You know what happens when you remove enough load-bearing walls from a building? It doesn't collapse all at once. It sags. Slowly. The doors stop closing right. The floors start creaking in places they never did before. And one day somebody walks through and says, "When did this place get so run down?" That's what erosion looks like. Inside a man who gave away everything that held him up. Here's the part that stings. They didn't lose themselves in the divorce. They lost themselves in the marriage. The divorce just made it visible. When the papers were signed and the house was split and the new apartment was quiet in a way that felt like a physical substance, They looked around and realized they had to rebuild a person. Not a life, that's logistics that comes together in weeks. Rebuilding the person, that takes years. Because the person was dismantled so gradually that most of them can't even remember the order in which the pieces were removed. So here's the question that changes everything. What happens when a man over 50 starts taking those pieces back, one by one? And more importantly, what happens to the way he sees women when he does? Frank, 6 months after the divorce, he walks into a diner near his apartment, sits at the counter. The waitress asks what he wants. And for the first time in longer than he can calculate, he doesn't think about what's fast, what's practical, what someone else would prefer. He orders what he wants. Eggs over easy, sourdough toast, black coffee, extra plate of fruit. He eats slowly. He reads the paper. Nobody needs him anywhere. And that morning, something shifts that he can't quite name. It feels almost like guilt. The particular guilt of a man who spent decades being needed and suddenly isn't. But under the guilt, there's something else. Something that feels like ground. Now, most people would look at that scene and think it's small. A man eating breakfast alone. But here's what they'd miss, and this is critical. That breakfast is the first brick. In a foundation he's never had before. A man who knows what he wants for breakfast is one step closer to knowing what he wants from a woman. And a man who knows what he wants from a woman is a man who will never again confuse the relief of being chosen with genuine connection. But the reclamation doesn't always go smoothly. That's the part nobody talks about. Consider Harlan, 51, accountant. Lost his wife to cancer 2 years ago. He picks up a guitar he hasn't touched in 25 years. He's terrible at it. His fingers don't remember the chords, and the sound coming out of that instrument would make a music teacher wince. But here's what matters. It's the first time in decades he's doing something purely because he wants to, not because someone needs him to, not because it serves a function in someone else's life. Just because his hands want to make sound and there's no one in the room to judge whether the sound is worth making. And that should feel liberating. But it doesn't. Not at first. It feels disorienting. Like a man who's been carrying a heavy pack for 30 years and suddenly puts it down. His body doesn't know how to stand upright without the weight. Harlan plays guitar for 11 minutes that first night, puts it down, and sits in silence for an hour wondering who he's becoming. That disorientation, that's the cost of reclaiming yourself after 50. Nobody warns you that freedom feels strange when you've spent most of your adult life earning the right to not have any. But slowly, week by week, Saturday by Saturday, the pieces come back. Raymond returns to the lake. Frank discovers he actually loves cooking when nobody's timing him. Harlan gets a little better at guitar, then a lot better, then stops caring whether he's better at all. The friendships that were dropped get rebuilt. Cautiously, one phone call at a time. The right to say no returns, not aggressively, not as a power move, just a simple, clean no that doesn't require 3 paragraphs of justification. Each piece is small. None of them make headlines. But stacked together, they form something that changes everything. About how these men walk into a room, how they hold a conversation, and especially how they look at the woman sitting across from them at dinner. Because here's the shift. And this is the part most people get wrong. You'd assume a man who spent years alone would be desperate, starving for warmth, ready to hand over everything the moment someone shows up with a smile and a kind word. That's the obvious story. But the truth is the exact opposite. A man who's rebuilt his foundation suddenly has something he never had before. In his entire romantic life, a reference point. He knows what his life feels like when it's working. Not working for the household. Not working for the marriage. Working for him. So when he looks at a woman now, he's not asking, can she complete me? He's asking, does she fit into something already whole? And those are radically different questions that produce radically different interactions. The man who asked, can she complete me? Tolerated chaos because anything felt better than the void. He mistook turbulence for passion. He confused the relief of being chosen with genuine connection. He stayed in situations that eroded him because the alternative, being alone again, still felt like failure. But the man who asks, does she fit into something already whole? Carries none of that. Not because he's rigid. Because he has a baseline. He knows what peace feels like. He knows what his own rhythm sounds like. And when someone enters his life and that rhythm turns into static, he notices immediately. The way a man who's lived next to the ocean notices when the waves change. He doesn't rationalize it. He doesn't tell himself that relationships are supposed to be hard. He simply registers that something's off, and he trusts what he's hearing. Which brings us to the moment that tests everything. Frank, 18 months after the divorce. He's dating again. Not aggressively. Not on 5 apps. He meets a woman through a friend of a friend. She's good. Smart, warm, genuinely kind. The kind of kindness that shows up in small moments, not just grand gestures. They have dinner 3 times over 2 weeks. The conversation is easy. The silences aren't uncomfortable. He's interested. Genuinely. Then on the third date, she says something almost offhand. I think you should cut back on the Sunday fishing. We could do brunch instead. She says it lightly. Maybe she doesn't even mean it as a test. But Frank hears it. He hears it the way a man who's been through a house fire hears the first crackle of dry wood. Not because she's wrong to want brunch. Not because her request is unreasonable in a vacuum. But because he's heard that exact sentence before. 25 years ago, it sounded like love. Now it sounds like the first line of a negotiation he's already completed and lost. He smiles. He pays the check. He doesn't call back. Not in anger. Not with a speech. Just with the quiet clarity of a man who knows which walls are load-bearing. And has decided, finally, permanently, that those walls don't move. Now, here's where most people would expect this story to end with a man alone. Firm, principled, but alone. That's the assumption. A man with 7 non-negotiables must be narrowing his options to nearly nothing, right? He must be pushing women away, coming across as cold or controlling or stuck in his ways. But that's not what happens. And this is the part worth sitting with. The women who've done their own version of this work, who've built their own foundations, who aren't looking for someone to complete them either, they recognize a man like Frank the moment they meet him. Not because he announces his list, because they can feel it. They can feel the difference between a man who's desperate for connection and a man who's choosing it. The way you can feel the difference between a house built on bedrock and one built on sand. Even if both look the same from the outside, a woman who's lived enough life to know what she wants can spot a man who's still gasping from across a restaurant. She can also spot the man who isn't. The man who asks questions because he's genuinely curious, not because he's running an audition. The man who's comfortable with a pause in the conversation, who doesn't rush to fill every silence with performance. The man whose life is clearly working, not in a flashy way, but in the way that shows up as calm, as patience, as the particular steadiness of someone who isn't going anywhere because he doesn't need to. That man doesn't need her. And here's the paradox, that's exactly what makes her stay. Not because it's a strategy. Because there is nothing more disarming than being chosen by someone who doesn't need you. Most people have never experienced that in their entire lives. When they do, they feel it immediately. It's the difference between someone grabbing your hand because they're falling and someone reaching for your hand because they want to walk beside you. Both involve hands. Only one involves choice. Two people who've both built that kind of groundedness don't build the usual kind of relationship. They don't fill gaps in each other. They add to each other. Two complete lives choosing to create something together that neither could have built alone. Not because either life was broken without the other, but because the combination produces something neither expected. Older men dating in 2026 don't surrender autonomy as a romantic gesture anymore. The math finally caught up to the romance. Their perspective on relationships past 50 includes a column called non-negotiable. And the column has 7 entries that don't move. Not because they don't care. Because they care enough about themselves, about her, about whatever they're building, to protect the structure that makes all of it possible. If you're a man over 50 standing on the edge of a new relationship, this is your pre-flight checklist. If you've already lost some of these items in a previous marriage and you're wondering if you're allowed to reclaim them, you are. And this is your permission slip. If you're a woman dating an older man, this is the architecture of the man you're choosing. It's not a wall. It's a foundation. And it's the reason there's someone solid standing in front of you. The men who come out the other side of this process rarely describe it in dramatic terms. They don't talk about transformation. They talk about a quieting, a settling of something that used to be very loud. The constant low-level anxiety of whether they were enough, whether they were doing enough. That noise ran in the background of every day for decades. They'd normalized it because they'd never known anything different. The solitude turned that noise off. Not permanently, not overnight, but over time, the static cleared enough that they could finally hear what was actually there. And what they found, in themselves, in the life they rebuilt, in the connections they eventually chose, turned out to be quieter than they expected, less dramatic, but far more solid than anything the noise had ever produced. A man who reaches that point doesn't look at women the way he used to. He doesn't see them through the lens of what he needs. He doesn't manage them or chase them or orbit them. He simply sees them, with the same honest, patient attention he finally learned to give himself. And from that place, from that calm, from that list of 7 things that will never move, he offers something most people have never been on the receiving end of. Presence. Real, chosen, grounded presence. And that, more than anything else, is what changes everything. If this landed somewhere real for you, 1 sentence in the comments. Which of the 7 did you give up last time and what did it cost? Subscribe if this is the conversation you've been looking for. New video every Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday.